So welcome to episode 2 in our series looking at how the Quarrymen became the Beatles. Now, we did the overview last time, so if you haven't seen that, click on the link and you can watch the first episode. Before we get into the personnel, let's look at what started everything, and that is Skiffle. Now, George Harrison once said, no Leadbelly, no Lonnie Donegan, no Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. A big statement to make. Let's explain what that's all about. So what is Skiffle? Now, Skiffle has its roots back in the 1920s in America. It's got its roots in American folk, bluegrass, blues. It's got all kinds of different connotations. Sometimes it was known as spasm music. Not the greatest of titles, I must admit, but Skiffle seems to be the one that they've stuck with. Quite often in some of the poorer communities, they would throw a rent party. If you were struggling to make the rent, then you'd use homemade instruments, whatever you could find. You'd put on one of these rent parties, and they'd, as we do here, pass the hat round, collect a few pennies, and you'd help to pay the rent. So that's sort of how it got started. Now, the term skiffle appears in America in the 1920s. At that time, there were things called jug bands. And the jug bands, you could have a washboard, jugs that you blow into the top of, have a wash tub bass. We over here had later the tea-chest bass, the wash tub bass there. Cigar box, fiddle, musical saw, comb and paper, kazoo, banjos, guitars, bit of everything. But in 1925, there was a record by Jimmy O'Brien and his Chicago Skifflers. So that's the first time it appears on record. After that, Dan Burley and his Skiffle Boys became really, really popular. Coming out with songs like Hometown Skiffle in 1929 and Skiffle Blues 1946. But the term skiffle in America died out in the 40s. There's then the skiffle revival in the UK, which is led by Lonnie Donegan. And he was covering songs by, as we mentioned at the beginning, Leadbelly, who wrote Rock Island Line. He's getting songs by Woody Guthrie, great American folk singer. And what Lonnie Donegan was doing, he was down in London, and he'd go to the US Embassy where they had a small part of the Library of Congress in there, and he would lend the records, and he'd learn all these songs. So that's why he was building up this repertoire of American songs. Now, he was in a jazz group. Now, this is where Ken Collier gets a lot of mention, and Chris Barber, and they had this jazz group. And what they would do is, with a lot of particularly the Dixieland jazz, you could only play for about 45 minutes without giving yourself an aneurysm with all the blowing on the trumpets and stuff. So they take an interval. In the interval, members of the group would come out and play. And that would be Lonnie Donegan on the guitar, Beryl Bryden on the washboard, and Chris Barber. And they'd play a few of these American songs. And these became known as skiffle breaks. So when they were doing these skiffle breaks and recording these songs, it was Ken Collier's brother who suggested calling it skiffle because he knew the records by Dan Burley and his Skiffle Boys. So that's how the term sort of comes into being in the UK. Now, Ken Collier leaves the group. It becomes Chris Barber's jazz band, and they bring out an album called New Orleans Joys. When they were looking for a couple of extra tracks, they suggested throwing on a couple of these skiffle songs, one of which was Rock Island Line. So then, at the end of 1955, Rock Island Line and John Henry comes out as a single for the Lonnie Donegan Skiffle Group. This just went ballistic. It sold 1 million copies worldwide. It was the first record in this country to go gold, and it got in the top 10 over here, and it got in the top 10 over in the US as well. This was the song at the beginning of 1956 that got kids to pick up instruments, particularly guitars, and form skiffle groups. And because you could have these homemade instruments, it was easy to do. So you would have the washboard like they had in the jug bands, the tea-chest bass here instead of the wash tub bass, guitars if you could get them, banjos. And with the Quarrymen, when they get themselves together, as we will see, they're unusual because they had a couple of guitars, a banjo, and a drummer, as well as the washboard and tea-chest bass. So Rock Island Line is there. It's in the charts. all these skiffle groups are suddenly starting all over the country. And it's the roots of all these skiffle groups that become a lot of the great musicians in the 1960s, starting with skiffle. So, yes, as George Harrison said, no Leadbelly, no Lonnie Donegan. Yeah, that's what Rock Out of the Line comes in. No Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. Because it was Lonnie Donegan that inspired John, Paul and George to pick up guitars and start learning them. So, Rock Out of the Line, here's the Quarrymen performing Rock Out of the Line at Strawberry Fields. What a song. Skiffle, this is where it all starts. Tune in next time, and we're going to start looking at how the Quarrymen actually become a group. See you next time.